Close your eyes for a moment and picture a scene. It's the year 1347. You stand in a bustling medieval marketplace on a warm spring morning. The air is full of movement and color. Merchants shout prices over one another, bargaining with eager customers. Children weave between stalls, laughing as they chase each other. Fresh bread cools on wooden tables, filling the air with a comforting warmth. Flowers spill from window ledges. A blacksmith's hammer rings rhythmically. Church bells echo across rooftops. Life feels steady, eternal, unshakable. Now, remove the sound. The marketplace is still there, but empty. Stalls have been left where they stood. Doors hang ajar. No laughter, no voices, no footfall. Only the wind moves, drifting through deserted streets and carrying a heavy, rotting scent. Everyone is gone. Not just this town, not just this region. Across an entire continent, nearly half of all people are dead within 5 years. This is not myth. This is not exaggeration. It is history. The Black Death, the most devastating event to strike Europe, killing more rapidly and more completely than any catastrophe the continent has ever known. Tonight, we are not simply reviewing dates and statistics. We are exploring what it felt like to live in a world that was ending. We will walk through the vibrant, flourishing society before the plague, the terror and collapse during it, and the radically transformed world that emerged afterward. This is a story about human beings, their vulnerability, their terror, their endurance. If you value slow, careful, deeply researched storytelling, settle in. This journey will last hours, and every moment will reveal something about civilization, fragility, and survival. Before we descend into that darkness, I ask you something. Have you ever felt the world shift beneath you? A moment when what once felt secure suddenly collapsed? Share your experiences. They enrich this shared history we are piecing together. Take a breath. Let us begin where the old world stood strongest, before its fall. Now allow me to show you how a world ended, and how against all odds, a new one came into being. We will not begin with death, but with life. With medieval Europe at its height, thriving, prosperous, confident, unaware that everything was about to fracture. The year is 1346, and Europe has never been more alive. To understand the magnitude of loss, we must first understand the world about to be destroyed. The Black Death did not strike a weak, primitive society. It tore apart a flourishing civilization at its peak, a society building monuments, knowledge, and institutions meant to last forever. In the early 14th century, Europe held roughly 75 million people, a population level not seen since the height of the Roman Empire. It had taken nearly a millennium to reach this point again after Rome's collapse. But by 1300, Europe had rebuilt itself and surpassed its former population. Cities expanded, trade networks connected England to North Africa, Italy to the Middle East. Universities grew. Gothic cathedrals rose like stone prayers lifted into the sky, attempts to touch heaven itself. This was no backward, dark age. This was a sophisticated society, with legal courts and codified law, international banking networks, agricultural systems producing food efficiently, artistic and intellectual traditions inherited from ancient Greece and Rome, and developed further. Books were copied, music composed, architecture designed with mathematical precision. Structures built in this era still stand today, 7 centuries later. The social hierarchy was rigid, but it offered stability. Peasants cultivated the land. Nobles governed estates and enforced law. Clergy preserved literacy, managed learning, and guided spiritual life. Knights defended the social order. Kings reigned under divine authority. Society was unequal, controlled, often harsh, but it functioned. Generations had lived under it. Life followed predictable patterns. Agriculture was flourishing due to innovations like the 3-field rotation system and improved plowing tools. Villages expanded, new towns were founded, the land was full. Trade flourished. Italian merchants dominated Mediterranean commerce. The Hanseatic League controlled northern shipping routes. Goods, wealth, and ideas flowed across borders. The church unified everything, culturally, spiritually, politically. Its power shaped kingdoms. Cathedrals expressed a world confident in its belief and purpose. These were projects meant not for decades, but for eternity. Intellectual life was vibrant. Thomas Aquinas had recently synthesized Aristotle's philosophy with Christian theology, forging a worldview that explained human nature, the universe, and God in a single system taught across Europe's universities. Even war, brutal as it was, followed known forms and codes of conduct. It was terrible, yes, but comprehensible, predictable, familiar. This was 1346, a world that believed in continuity and order, a world certain that tomorrow would resemble today. But it was wrong. In the far steppes of Central Asia, a disease, old, patient, and merciless, was moving, carried by fleas, traveling on rats, riding in the cargo of merchant ships linked to the same trade networks that sustained European prosperity. When those ships arrived in European harbors, everything changed. The old world ended. But we are ahead of ourselves. To truly grasp the scale of what was destroyed, we must walk through this world, its rhythms, its structures, its hopes, and understand it as a living reality. Because only when we see what existed can we understand the depth of the loss when the plague arrived in 1347. And it did arrive, to a world utterly unprepared for the end. Let us begin with the world as it existed before everything changed. Picture a specific moment, a real time, a real place. Allow me to take you there. The year is early spring, 1346. The setting is a moderately sized town in northern France. We can call it Beaumont, though the name itself is incidental. What matters is that this town could stand in for hundreds, like it's scattered across the continent. To understand the scale of the catastrophe that was coming, we must understand the patterns of everyday existence that it would destroy. Beaumont is home to perhaps 3,000 people, not large by modern standards, but a significant settlement for the 14th century. Thick stone walls encircle its central district, protecting its citizens from bandits, and in times of conflict, from marauding armies. The church dominates the town square, its towers rising high enough to be seen across the farmlands that stretch outward in every direction. Construction on this church began 8 decades earlier, and still, the work is not entirely finished. The townspeople, now adding decorative carvings, are continuing a project begun by their grandparents. The town is a network of narrow, winding streets, not paved but worn smooth by centuries of footsteps. Houses stand tightly packed, many leaning so closely toward one another at the upper levels that the rooftops nearly touch, creating dim passageways below. Most of the buildings are timber-framed structures with wattle and daub walls, their thatched roofs venting thin trails of smoke from the cooking fires within. Merchants of some wealth live in sturdier stone houses with ceramic roof tiles, subtle but unmistakable declarations of status. Let us observe a single day in this place. As dawn approaches, the church bells ring the hour of prime, calling the faithful to prayer. Though not everyone attends the service, the bells themselves shape the rhythm of life, marking the passage of time in a world where few households own clocks. Jean, a skilled carpenter, rises at first light. He is 42 years old, considered an elder by the expectations of his age. He has survived childhood sickness, narrow escapes from accidents, and the occasional season of hunger. His success is modest but real. He owns his workshop, trains 2 apprentices, and provides enough for his wife and 4 living children. 2 more were lost in infancy, a sorrow so common that it is woven into the shared emotional experience of parenthood. Jean begins his morning with coarse bread and weak ale. Water is rarely safe to drink, so even children consume diluted beer. Marie, his wife, has already been awake, tending the vegetable plot behind the house, managing the careful economy of daily survival, a skill honed through 20 years of marriage. Their children all contribute. The eldest, a 15-year-old son, works with Jean to learn the trade. The 12-year-old daughter assists Marie, acquiring the skills necessary to maintain a future household of her own. The younger children have simpler responsibilities, carrying water, feeding livestock, fetching small items when needed. As Jean walks to his workshop, the town is beginning to stir. The smell of fresh loaves drifts from the baker's shop. The blacksmith's forge glows red as metal meets hammer. In the square, peasants from the surrounding countryside unpack baskets of eggs, wheels of cheese, wild greens, chickens, and seasonal produce. Local trade is regulated by guilds, formal associations that determine who may practice which craft, ensure quality standards, and provide communal support to members in need. Jean belongs to the Carpenters Guild, which does not merely set wages and rules, but also functions as a religious society, a charitable institution, and a social fraternity. Guilds organize feast days, sponsor church repairs, and care for the families of craftsmen who die unexpectedly. Religion is the framework of life. Everyone attends Sunday Mass and the many holy days that punctuate the year. The church operates the only hospital, the only organized charity, and the only schools. Priests are among the few literate men, guardians of Latin texts and custodians of classical and theological knowledge. The church calendar governs seasonal rhythms, Lent, Easter, feast days of saints, Christmas, each marking shifts in communal and spiritual life. Social hierarchy is everywhere visible. The town's lord resides in a manor overlooking the settlement, though he seldom visits. His steward collects rents, adjudicates disputes, and enforces feudal obligations. Peasants farming his land must give him part of their harvest and perform labor on his fields before working their own. This arrangement is accepted as the natural, divinely sanctioned order. People believe that those of high status are elevated by God, while those of low status are placed so by His will. Questioning this order is almost unthinkable. Yet, contrary to modern assumption, social mobility is not entirely absent. A talented craftsman like Jean can secure dignity and stability. A bright peasant boy may join the church where learning and intellect carry weight. A shrewd merchant may acquire enough wealth to rival minor nobles. The structure is rigid, but not entirely unyielding. Entertainment and leisure exist, though different from modern pleasures. Traveling minstrels, storytellers, and traders bring tales from distant lands. Feast days transform work into celebration. Young men train with bows as required by law, ensuring military readiness. Women spin wool together, turning labor into companionship. Evenings are spent near the hearth, telling stories, teaching lessons, sharing small joys. Health is precarious. Everyone knows that injury, childbirth, infection, or sudden fever can bring death swiftly. Life expectancy at birth is about 30, though this reflects high infant mortality. Those who survive childhood may live into their 50s, 60s, or even 70s. Jean's father lived to 63, a sign of resilience in the family line. Yet the presence of death is constant. It shapes faith, generosity, fear, and the urgency of prayer. Medicine is a blend of tradition, observation, belief, and guesswork. The inherited theory of the four humors, blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, explains illness as imbalance. Treatments include bloodletting, purging, herbal tonics, and controlled diets. Some remedies are effective, others do nothing or cause harm. Lacking any knowledge of microbes, medieval healers do what they can. This is life in Beaumont in 1346. Ordinary life, consistent life, a pattern repeated across generations. Jean assumes his son will inherit his trade, his daughter will marry within the community, and his grandchildren will walk the same roads and kneel in the same church. He cannot imagine that within 3 years, half the people he knows will be gone. He cannot foresee the collapse of trade, the abandonment of homes, the shattering of every assumption about continuity and order. Yet, Even as Jean works in his shop, events far away are already unfolding, events that will transform his world forever. In the Black Sea port of Kaffa, a siege is underway. Mongol armies surround a Genoese trading post. Their soldiers are falling ill from a terrifying and unfamiliar sickness, one that causes swollen, blackened buboes, fever, delirium, and death within days. Desperate, the attackers hurl the corpses of the dead over the city walls by trebuchet. Whether this act was strategic or born of despair remains debated, but its effect was catastrophic. The disease entered the city, and when it spread beyond control, the remaining Genoese merchants fled, boarding ships bound for Italy. They carried goods, wealth, and the hope of escape, but also rats infected with fleas, carrying Yersinia pestis, the bacterium that causes plague. When their ships reached Sicily in October 1347, officials tried to turn them away, but rats had already disembarked. Fleas had already found new hosts. The contagion had already begun. Within days, people in Messina fell sick. Within weeks, the city was collapsing. From Sicily, the disease traveled across Italy, into France, into Germany, across the Channel, into England, following the same trade routes that sustained medieval civilization. The Black Death had arrived. Jean, the carpenter, living peacefully in Beaumont, still believes his future is secure. But the world he knows has already begun to end. The wave of death is moving toward him, silent, unstoppable. Before we follow it further, we must understand what this disease was, why it killed so efficiently, and how it spread. Not myth, not divine wrath, but a bacterium. And so we move from the world before into the arrival of death. The arrival from Kaffa to Sicily, 1346-1347. The illness that shattered medieval Europe was the bubonic plague, caused by the bacterium Yersinia pestis. People in the Middle Ages had no idea this was the cause. They couldn't see bacteria, and they did not understand how diseases spread. They formed theories, some with small hints of truth and others completely incorrect. But none of them truly explained the reality. Today, however, we know what they did not. And this scientific understanding helps us see why the plague was so destructive, why medieval efforts failed, and why the disease killed so efficiently. Yersinia pestis is an ancient bacterium that most likely developed in Central Asia. It mainly lives among rodent populations such as marmots, rats, and ground squirrels. In these animal communities, the disease circulates continually. Sometimes there are waves of deaths among the rodents, but the bacterium never disappears entirely. It maintains itself because it has an extremely effective method of transmission: fleas. Fleas are tiny parasites that survive by drinking blood. When a flea bites a rodent that has the plague, the flea swallows the bacteria along with the blood. The bacteria multiply inside the flea's stomach until they clog its digestive tract. The flea becomes starving, desperately hungry, but it can no longer swallow properly. When it tries to bite a new host to feed, it vomits infected material into the bite wound. This process spreads the disease very efficiently from one host to another. Under normal conditions, this system allows the bacteria to survive without wiping out the rodent population entirely. Some rats die, others survive and develop resistance, and the disease continues in a stable cycle. This balance between host and parasite developed over thousands of years. But sometimes this balance is broken. Environmental shifts, perhaps changes in climate affecting rodent numbers, can cause massive die-offs among infected rodents. When large numbers of rodents die, fleas lose their primary hosts and must find new sources of blood. They turn to humans and to the rats that live near human settlements. This is what happened in the 1340s. Somewhere in Central Asia, likely in present-day Mongolia or Western China, something triggered a massive decline in rodent populations. Fleas, desperate for food, jumped to humans and to the rats that lived in villages and towns. From that point, the disease moved along long-distance trade routes. The Silk Road, which connected the East and West, did not only transfer goods, but also carried infected rats and fleas. Caravans traveling west spread the disease to new regions. Ships transporting cargo also carried rats, allowing the plague to travel from port to port. At every stop along the way, new people, new rats, and new environments enabled the disease to continue spreading. The plague arrived in the Crimean region by 1346. During the siege of Kaffa, large numbers of infected individuals were concentrated in one place. Whether biological warfare was used or not, the situation allowed the disease to spread quickly. When Genoese traders fled by sea, they unknowingly carried the infection with them to Sicily. Once the plague reached Europe, it spread with horrifying speed. European towns provided ideal conditions for transmission. Cities were crowded, sanitation was extremely poor, and rats lived everywhere near people. Trade routes linked city to city, ensuring constant movement of goods and travelers. No one had immunity because the disease had not been present in Europe for centuries. Most critically, because people did not understand how the plague spread, they could not take effective precaution. The disease appeared in 3 different forms, all caused by the same bacterium, but differing depending on how the infection entered the body. Bubonic plague. This was the most common form. It developed when an infected flea bit a person and introduced the bacteria into the lymphatic system. Within a few days, large swellings known as buboes appeared in the lymph nodes, especially in the groin, armpits, or neck. These swellings could grow as large as an apple and caused unbearable pain. Victims developed high fevers, confusion, and severe suffering. Sometimes the skin turned black because of internal bleeding, which is how the plague came to be called the Black Death. Most people died within 3 to 7 days, though perhaps 20% survived. Pneumonic plague. This form occurred when the bacteria infected the lungs. It might develop from bubonic plague or spread directly from one person to another through droplets expelled when an infected person coughed. Pneumonic plague was even more deadly than bubonic plague, killing almost every victim within 2 to 3 days. It spread easily from person to person, making it extremely dangerous. Septicemic plague. This form happened when the bacteria entered the bloodstream directly, possibly through an open cut. It was nearly always fatal, often killing within hours or a single day, sometimes before buboes could even form. All 3 forms circulated during the Black Death. Medieval people saw the different symptoms and believed multiple diseases must be at work. They were correct that the symptoms varied greatly, but they were wrong in assuming different causes. The effects of the disease were horrifying. Victims developed sudden high fever, chills, weakness, and then the painful buboes. The skin sometimes turned black, shocking witnesses and adding to fear. Many sufferers became delirious or violent from the pain. The smell of sickness was overwhelming, rotting flesh while the person was still alive. The disease spread unbelievably fast. Someone could feel normal in the morning and be dead by nightfall. Entire households disappeared in days. A single traveler could bring the plague to a new town, and within weeks half the population might be dead. Doctors were powerless. They did not know the cause and could only offer treatments based on theories of balancing bodily fluids or releasing poisonous vapors. They used bloodletting, poultices on buboes, purging diets, or prayer. None of these helped. Many treatments made patients weaker, speeding death. Physicians knew they were helpless, and many abandoned their patients to save themselves. Those who stayed often died themselves. By the time the plague faded, the medical profession had lost many of its members and much of its credibility. The church tried to give spiritual comfort. Priests offered last rites, prayers, and reassurance. But they too died in large numbers. Their duty required them to visit the sick, leaving them constantly exposed. Many paid with their lives. Ordinary people created their own explanations. Some believed foul air caused the disease and tried to protect themselves with flowers, herbs, or burning pleasant-smelling wood. This did not stop infection, though it may have been comforting. Many believed the plague was punishment from God for sin. This belief led to terrible consequences that we will explore later. But within medieval belief systems, the idea made sense. If God ruled the world and nothing happened without divine intent, then such destruction must be a judgment. The response was repentance and displays of religious devotion. Some people came closer to a correct understanding. They noticed the disease seemed to spread from person to person and realized that avoiding the sick could reduce risk. Quarantine practices were introduced. Venice developed the 40-day isolation period, quarantina, from which we get the word quarantine. Ships arriving from infected regions were kept offshore for 40 days to see whether illness appeared on board. This method occasionally worked, but it was often undermined. Merchants protested delays, crew members sneaked ashore, rats escaped from ships, and goods such as grain or cloth could carry fleas. The arrival of plague in any region followed a predictable pattern. First came rumors of a deadly disease in distant places. People did not believe the reports or assumed the problem would not reach them. News traveled slowly, and the reality sounded too extreme to be real. Then came the first few cases, a traveler, a sailor, a merchant, and then the first deaths. At first, communities hoped the illness was something else. Then came the sudden outbreak, dozens falling sick, then hundreds, as the disease spread through families and neighborhoods. Denial turned panic, and panic turned into overwhelming catastrophe. To understand the scale, we must look at real places and real timelines. Otherwise, the numbers become too abstract, and we forget these were real human lives. In Messina, Sicily, in October 1347, Genoese ships arrived carrying the plague. Within days, people began to fall sick. By November, hundreds were dead. People fled into the countryside, unknowingly carrying the disease with them. By January 1348, perhaps half of Messina's population was gone. From Sicily, the plague moved north into Italy. Florence, one of the richest and most culturally important cities in Europe, was struck in April 1348. The writer Giovanni Boccaccio witnessed the devastation and later described it in the Decameron. He wrote of corpses piling in the streets because there were too few healthy people left to bury the dead, of family members abandoning each other in fear, and of moral and social order collapsing. Florence, the center of art and learning, was brought to ruin in just months. From Italy, the plague moved into France. In Marseille, it arrived in January 1348, spreading rapidly through the port and the surrounding region. Paris saw its first cases in June 1348, and by the end of the summer, thousands were dying each week. The plague reached England in June 1348, entering through the port of Melcombe Regis in Dorset. It spread along the coast and then inland. By November, London was overwhelmed. Winter slowed its advance but did not stop it. By 1349, Scotland, Wales, and Ireland were infected. The disease crossed into Germany, Scandinavia, Eastern Europe, and even Iceland, carried by sick sailors. Only a few isolated regions escaped, some parts of Poland, certain mountain valleys, and a few islands that successfully sealed themselves off. The speed was astonishing. From October 1347 to the end of 1349, just 2 years, the plague had spread across nearly all of Europe. It traveled at the pace of medieval transportation, carried unknowingly by people and rats. Everywhere the same pattern repeated: disbelief, then fear, then mass death and social collapse. The plague stopped only when it had either killed or immunized most of the population, or when it faded for reasons that were not understood. Calculating the death toll is difficult because many records were lost or never kept. But historians estimate that between 40% and 60% of Europe's population died between 1347 and 1353. Europe had around 75 million people before the plague. Perhaps 35 to 40 million died in 5 years. To understand this scale in modern terms, imagine 150 million Americans dying in 5 years, or 300 million Chinese, or 350 million Indians. The numbers are enormous to the point of disbelief. This was not like war, which usually affects mostly young men. The plague struck everyone: children, adults, the elderly, the rich, the poor, priests, nobles, farmers, scholars. It did not respect wealth status or education. It killed at random, although today we know it hit hardest where people lived in crowded, dirty conditions near rats. But even kings and bishops died. The disease destroyed talented individuals and ordinary people alike. It took the experienced and the young, the strong and the weak. The survivors found themselves in a world changed beyond recognition. Before we explore how societies rebuilt themselves after such enormous devastation, we must look at how people reacted during the catastrophe itself. How did people behave when their world collapsed, when half the population they knew died? When institutions failed, explanations failed, and hope nearly disappeared? The answers reveal the full range of human behavior. There were acts of bravery, kindness, and self-sacrifice. There were also acts of panic, cruelty, and blame. Most responses were simply human, people trying to protect themselves and their loved ones, trying to understand the incomprehensible, trying to remain humane in a world that made dignity nearly impossible. Now, let us move forward to Part 3, where we look closely at these human reactions: the medical struggles, the religious interpretations, the breakdown of social order, and the attempts to make meaning in the face of overwhelming death. Part 3. The Spread. How the plague consumed a continent. The plague spread across Europe with frightening speed, swift like wildfire but far less predictable. Instead of following a clear pattern, it seemed to strike randomly, destroying some places instantly while bypassing others, making it feel almost intentional or evil. This unpredictability fueled fear. People could not see the cause, could not stop it, and often, unknowingly, made the situation worse. The main carriers were rats and the fleas that lived on them. Medieval towns were perfect environments for rats. Markets, food storage areas, rubbish piles, and poorly sealed buildings provided endless food and shelter. Cats existed, but not in enough numbers to control rat populations. Rats lived beside humans, eating their grain, nesting in their walls, and multiplying rapidly. Many of these rats carried fleas infected with the plague bacterium. When an infected rat died, the flea immediately searched for a new host. It might jump to another rat, and when that rat died, to another, and eventually to humans. This is why the plague sometimes appeared in towns with no visibly sick travelers. Rats traveled in ship cargo, in grain sacks, and along roads. Trade, prosperity, and movement all became pathways for death. The more connected a city was, the faster and harder it was struck. Ships were the most efficient carriers. A single ship leaving an Italian port could bring plague to England in weeks, faster than word of the disease could travel. When ships docked, rats ran down mooring ropes into warehouses and city streets. Major ports, Venice, Genoa, Barcelona, Marseille, London, were among the first and worst hit. Ironically, the very wealth and trade networks that made medieval Europe thrive now helped spread devastation. But trade was not the only path. Pilgrimages, armies, and refugees also carried the disease. Pilgrims traveling to holy sites spread plague unknowingly. Soldiers moved it along military routes. Desperate families fleeing infected cities brought it into the countryside, to places that had once seemed safe. Because the incubation period was usually 2 to 6 days, infected people could travel far before realizing they were sick. Sometimes they collapsed on the road, dying alone. In other cases, they reached their destination and seemed healthy, only to fall ill days later, exposing everyone around them before symptoms even appeared. Without understanding how disease spread, medieval Europeans tried many methods to protect themselves. Most failed. The wealthy fled cities as soon as the plague appeared. Flee early, go far, return late became their rule. But escape was uncertain. Servants traveling with them might already be infected. Refugees crossed paths with others fleeing from elsewhere. Only those who could isolate completely, such as nobles with remote estates or monks in secluded monasteries, survived reliably. Most people, however, could not leave. Peasants were tied to land and obligations. City workers relied on daily wages. The poor had nowhere to go. Many turned to religion, churches filled with people praying for mercy. But gathering crowds only spread the disease faster. Religious processions carrying relics through the streets also increased infection. Some cities attempted quarantine, especially Venetian ports, requiring ships to wait offshore for 40 days. Houses were sealed with sick families inside. Large districts were barricaded. These measures sometimes slowed the spread, but were hard to enforce. Fear broke rules more often than officials could uphold them. And quarantine could not stop rats and fleas, which ignored all human boundaries. People also tried cleaning streets and burning herbs to purify the air. They sometimes killed cats and dogs thinking they spread disease. This was a tragic mistake, as fewer cats meant more rats. Medical treatment was desperate and largely harmful. Doctors attempted bleeding, purging, lancing swollen buboes, and applying herbal pastes. Some prescribed bizarre cures, drinking crushed gemstones, inhaling sewage fumes, or wearing amulets. But nothing cured the disease. The famous plague doctor outfit with its beaked mask came later, and even then it offered only limited protection. The church played a complicated role. Many priests, monks, and nuns cared for the sick, buried the dead, and administered last rites, knowing they would likely die themselves. The clergy suffered devastating losses, perhaps half perished. Yet the church struggled to explain the plague. If it was divine punishment, why did devout believers die alongside sinners? When prayer did not stop the deaths, some people lost faith. Others looked for scapegoats. When supernatural explanations failed, fear turned to suspicion and violence, something we will examine in the next section. Meanwhile, society began to collapse. The death of so many workers caused labor shortages. Fields could not be harvested, crops rotted, shops closed, trade halted, food became scarce, courts stopped functioning, property ownership became unclear when entire families died at once. Crime rose as law enforcement broke down. Family loyalty showed both its strongest and weakest sides. Some families cared for each other to the end. Others fled their sick loved ones in terror, not always out of selfishness, but sometimes to protect surviving children. Many faced terrible choices with no morally right answers. Some people responded with reckless indulgence, believing death was unavoidable, so they drank, feasted, and spent whatever money they had left. Others turned to extreme piety, giving away possessions, praying constantly, or joining groups that whipped themselves in hopes of gaining God's forgiveness. Everywhere, death overwhelmed the living. There were simply too many bodies to bury. Mass graves filled quickly. Corpses were stacked without ceremony. Men hired to collect bodies became wealthy briefly, then died themselves. Cities filled with the smell of smoke from burning infected belongings, the tolling of funeral bells, and the silence of empty streets. The numbers are staggering. Florence lost around 70,000 people. Venice lost 50,000. Paris lost around 100,000. London lost about half its population. Entire villages vanished. Monasteries lost nearly all their members. Universities closed. Cathedral construction halted. Trade networks collapsed. Governments weakened when rulers and administrators died. Even the 100 Years' War paused because both armies lacked soldiers. By the time the first great wave ended around 1350, Europe was permanently changed. Its population had been cut by roughly half. Economies fell apart. Traditional social order cracked. Religious certainty was shaken. The world no longer felt stable or protected. But the tragedy did not end there. The plague returned repeatedly, 1361, 1369, and on for centuries. Later outbreaks were smaller, but the disease became a constant presence in Europe until the 1700s. The first wave, however, was the one that broke medieval society and forced the birth of a new world. Before we explore how Europe rebuilt itself, we must confront the darkest response of all, when fear and suffering drove people to turn against one another. Part 4. Medical Responses, Plague Doctors and Medieval Medicine. When the Black Death swept across medieval Europe, it struck a world that did not have the scientific knowledge needed to understand it. Physicians, healers, and ordinary people faced a terrifying disease that appeared suddenly, killed swiftly, and could not be predicted or controlled. Medieval doctors did not know about bacteria or infection, and they had no microscopes, antibiotics, or understanding of how disease spreads. Yet despite the limits of their knowledge, they did not face the plague passively. They observed, reasoned, debated, treated, and sometimes risked their own lives to help the sick. Their methods may seem ineffective or even harmful today, but they acted using the best medical theory available to them. In many cases, their courage was remarkable because they understood very well that treating the plague could mean their own death. The main medical framework that guided medieval physicians was the ancient humoral theory, a system passed down from Greek physicians like Hippocrates and Galen. According to this theory, the human body contained 4 humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Health depended on keeping these 4 humors in proper balance. If a humor became excessive, corrupt, or too dominant, illness followed. Although this explanation sounds unscientific to us now, in the medieval worldview it made sense. The 4 humors were associated with the structure of the universe itself, the 4 elements of nature, the 4 seasons, and even the 4 stages of human life. The system was elegant, interconnected, and offered physicians a complete method for diagnosing and treating disease, at least in theory. When the plague began to spread, physicians tried to interpret it through this humoral lens. Some believed the plague resulted from an excess of corrupt black bile. Others thought poison spread through the air. And some blamed planetary alignment or disturbances in the atmosphere. With no knowledge of microbes, they focused on balancing the body rather than eliminating an external agent. The most common method used to restore balance was bloodletting. Doctors opened a vein in the arm and allowed blood to drain in the hope that it would remove the poisoned humor. The amount of blood removed depended on the doctor's judgment. Some removed it gradually, while others bled patients until they fainted. Today, we know this treatment only made patients weaker, but at the time, it was supported by medical tradition and reinforced by the occasional survival of a patient who likely would have lived regardless. Other treatments followed the same logic. Doctors gave strong medicines that forced vomiting or bowel movements, believing that harmful substances could be expelled from the body. These treatments only exhausted already weak patients. Dietary recommendations were also common. Foods were believed to influence the humors, so plague sufferers were advised to avoid heating foods like meat and spices, and instead eat cooling foods such as fruit and vegetables. These changes did not cure plague, but they were at least less damaging than bleeding and purging. The most visible sign of plague infection was the bubo, a painful swelling that appeared under the arms, in the groin, or on the neck. Physicians often attempted to treat these swellings directly. They applied poultices made of figs, herbs, butter, or oils in the belief that these substances could draw poison out through the skin. Heated cups were used to create suction over the bubo, and some doctors pierced the swelling to release the fluid inside. At times, lancing a bubo brought temporary relief, since it reduced pressure and allowed infected material to drain. But without understanding cleanliness or sterilization, this procedure also risked causing additional infection. Although these treatments could ease pain briefly, none were able to stop the course of the disease. Access to medical care also differed by social class. Wealthy patients could afford to summon trained physicians, purchase expensive medicines, and receive treatments at home. Ironically, this sometimes made their situation worse. The wealthy were more aggressively bled and purged because they could pay for continuous treatment, and many died faster as a result. Poorer people who could not afford university-trained physicians relied on local healers, herbalists, midwives, and wise women. These healers used remedies passed down by tradition, teas, salves, vinegar washes, and herbal mixtures. While none of these remedies cured the plague, some provided comfort. For example, willow bark relieved fever and pain because it contains a natural form of the chemical found in aspirin. Yet relief was not the same as survival. One of the most widespread folk remedies was known as Four Thieves vinegar, a mixture of vinegar infused with herbs, believed to purify the air and protect the person who used it. A popular legend said that thieves who robbed plague victims used this vinegar to avoid infection. The story was dramatic, and people desperately wanted to believe it, so the remedy became popular even though it offered no protection. The fear and desperation surrounding the plague created opportunities for exploitation. Markets filled with amulets, charms, prayers, crystals, and relics that promised safety. People paid high prices for these objects, hoping for protection. Many healers and physicians did their best to help, but others took advantage of widespread panic to sell fraudulent cures. As death spread throughout cities and villages, trust in doctors began to collapse. People saw that the wealthy died just as quickly as the poor, that expensive medicines worked no better than simple home remedies, and that physicians themselves were not immune. Some doctors fled to protect themselves, while others stayed and died. The conclusion many people drew was that medicine was powerless. Yet even in their failure, some physicians made observations that would later prove important. They noticed that plague spread more quickly in crowded places, and that people who avoided contact with the sick were less likely to become ill. They also observed that plague seemed to follow the movement of travelers and goods. These insights led some cities, particularly in Italy, to introduce quarantine measures. Ships arriving from infected regions were held in harbor for weeks before passengers were allowed to enter. Houses with plague sufferers were locked and watched. Travel was restricted between towns. These measures could not stop the plague entirely, but they slowed its spread. The idea that governments had a responsibility to protect public health began here in these emergency responses to crisis. One of the most iconic images associated with plague is the figure of the plague doctor. The costume we recognize today, long waxed coat, leather gloves, broad hat, and the famous beaked mask, was standardized in the 17th century after the time of the Black Death, but it came to symbolize the struggle between medicine and disease. The beak of the mask was filled with aromatic herbs intended to purify the air, based on the belief that plague spread through poisonous vapors called miasma. While the theory was wrong, the costume unintentionally provided some real protection. The mask kept the doctor's face farther from patient's breath, reducing exposure to pneumonic plague. The thick clothing made it harder for fleas to bite. The gloves and staff prevented direct contact with patients. Thus, even though the reasoning was incorrect, the practice offered some defense. Plague doctors lived strange and dangerous lives. Some were hired by cities to treat the poor and were paid high wages because their work was deadly. Others volunteered out of compassion or a sense of duty. Still others were untrained men seeking profit or status. Many plague doctors died within weeks of beginning their work. Their appearance in a neighborhood caused fear because it meant that death had arrived. Despite their failures, some plague doctors kept careful records of the disease. They documented symptoms, patterns of spread, and mortality rates. They noticed that some people exposed to plague did not fall ill and that survivors rarely became sick again, suggesting the existence of natural resistance or immunity. These observations would later become important to scientific understanding, even though medieval physicians did not yet know how to explain them. The inability of medicine to prevent or cure the plague deeply affected how people understood the world. The belief that knowledge, wealth, or social status could protect someone proved to be false. The plague killed without distinction. This realization shattered confidence in human reason and the ordered structure of society. Some physicians and scholars turned away from medical explanations and instead claimed that the plague was a punishment sent by God. If no physical cure existed, they argued, then only repentance and prayer could save the soul, even if the body was doomed. This shift allowed doctors to maintain a role in society, even as they admitted they could not cure the disease. In the long term, the failure of humoral medicine during the Black Death planted seeds of change. Universities lost professors and students, and many medical manuscripts were lost, breaking the continuity of medical teaching. Yet at the same time, the crisis created openings for new thinkers, new institutions, and new ideas. Hospitals gradually shifted from religious charity houses into institutions concerned with public health and medical treatment. City governments learned to manage disease through quarantine and sanitation. Slowly, over generations, physicians began to question the assumptions of humoral theory. This questioning would eventually lead to the development of modern medicine. During the Black Death, however, these future transformations were not visible. What people experienced was confusion, fear, and grief. They watched physicians struggle to save lives, but fail again and again. They saw healers try their best, but their best was not enough. They learned that humans were far more vulnerable than they had imagined, and they were forced to confront the possibility that nature, fate, or God did not guarantee their survival. It was in the shadow of this medical helplessness that darker responses to the plague emerged. Blame, hatred, scapegoating, and violence, responses born not from knowledge, but from fear. Part 5. Human Darkness. When a society is struck by a disaster beyond understanding, when familiar explanations collapse and fear becomes stronger than reason, people often search desperately for someone to blame. The Black Death created this atmosphere on a scale rarely seen in history. Death appeared suddenly, spread invisibly, and spared no class or region. When no remedy worked and no prayer seemed to help, many communities turned their fear outward. Rather than seeing plague as a disease that affected all, some chose to believe that it had been caused deliberately by human enemies. This was not a reasoned judgment, but a reaction born from terror. In that state, people who were already marginalized became targets. The plague did not create hatred, but it gave older prejudices new and violent force. The most tragic victims of this wave of fear were the Jewish communities of Europe. Anti-Jewish prejudice already existed long before the plague. Jews had been treated as outsiders in Christian Europe for centuries. Laws and customs restricted almost every aspect of their lives. They were barred from owning land, banned from joining craft guilds, and excluded from many occupations. They often lived in segregated neighborhoods and were required to wear identifying clothing or badges. Violence, forced conversions, and expulsions had occurred repeatedly in earlier centuries. So, when the plague arrived, European societies already had a cultural readiness to blame Jews for any crisis. Yet Jews also played a crucial economic role. Because Christian doctrine forbade lending money at interest, Christians were not allowed to serve as moneylenders. Jews not bound by that restriction were permitted to provide essential financial services. This created a painful contradiction. Society needed Jewish lenders, but resented them. When kings, nobles, or towns owed Jews large debts, eliminating the Jewish community could erase those debts overnight. So when plague terrorized Europe, older resentments and economic motives merged with panic and became deadly. Rumors began spreading that Jews had poisoned wells to spread the plague. The accusation made no logical sense. Jewish communities were dying at the same rate as Christian communities. They lived in the same cities and drank from the same wells. Poisoning the water would have killed them too. But fear does not rely on logic. People saw neighbors dying rapidly and needed an explanation they could see and punish. The rumor was enough. Once accusations began, they followed a familiar pattern. Someone claimed to have found suspicious powder near a well. Someone claimed to have seen a Jewish person acting strangely. Individuals were arrested. Torture was used to extract confessions. Under intense pain, many confessed crimes they had not committed. These forced confessions were then read aloud as proof that the conspiracy was real. Violence followed quickly and spread widely. Between 1348 and 1350, Jewish communities across parts of France, the Holy Roman Empire, and other regions were attacked. In some cities, mobs stormed Jewish homes, dragged families into public squares, and murdered them. In others, entire Jewish neighborhoods were sealed off and set on fire. In Strasbourg in February 1349, nearly 2,000 Jews were burned alive in a single day. In Mainz, thousands were killed. Similar events occurred in Cologne, Erfurt, and dozens of smaller towns. By the end of the plague years, hundreds of Jewish communities had been destroyed. The scale of the violence was immense. Some authorities attempted to stop the massacres. Pope Clement VI issued official statements declaring that Jews were not responsible for the plague, and he ordered Christians not to harm them. Some kings and local rulers also tried to protect Jewish communities, either out of genuine belief in justice or because Jewish financiers were important to their economies. But fear-driven mobs often ignored these commands. Notably, the worst violence tended to happen in places where the plague had not yet arrived. In areas where people had already witnessed the plague firsthand, they understood that it killed indiscriminately. Shared suffering sometimes led to compassion, but in places where plague was still only a terrifying rumor, panic mixed with imagination and hatred filled the void. The destruction of Jewish communities had long-term consequences. Many Jews who survived fled eastward, especially to Poland and Lithuania, where some rulers offered protection. These migrations reshaped the geography of Jewish life for centuries. Meanwhile, regions that expelled or murdered their Jewish residents lost valuable knowledge, scholarship, medicine, and economic expertise. The violence caused not only moral loss, but also cultural and intellectual impoverishment. Jews were not the only scapegoats. Lepers, who already lived on the margins of society, were sometimes accused of deliberately spreading plague. Their illness made them visibly different and therefore easy targets. Some were executed or driven out of their communities. Foreigners, beggars, and travelers were also attacked in certain regions. Anyone perceived as outsider could become a convenient sacrifice during times of fear. A different and dramatic response came from the groups known as the flagellants. These were bands of men who believed that plague was God's punishment for human sin. They traveled from town to town performing public acts of extreme penance. Stripping to the waist, they whipped themselves with leather scourges embedded with bits of metal, drawing blood as they marched through streets chanting prayers. Crowds gathered to watch, some out of horror, others out of desperate hope. For a brief time, many towns welcomed them, believing that their suffering might persuade God to show mercy. But as the movement grew, it became more radical. Some flagellant groups began preaching that the church had become corrupt and that they, through their suffering, had been granted special spiritual authority. They attacked clergy and sometimes joined in attacks on Jews. Their growing independence alarmed both church and secular authorities. Pope Clement VI condemned the movement and kings ordered the flagellant processions to end. By the early 1350s, the movement was suppressed, though smaller groups continued to appear during later outbreaks. Not all responses to plague were driven by hatred or religious fervor. For many people, the collapse of normal life created a sense that moral rules no longer mattered. If death could strike at any moment, why worry about the future? Some accounts describe people abandoning families, looting homes of the dead, indulging in constant drinking or sexual excess. Other accounts describe the opposite, individuals withdrawing into deep religious devotion, rejecting all pleasure, praying day and night. Most people likely fell somewhere between these extremes, trying to survive while trying to preserve some sense of dignity. Yet in many towns and villages, social order genuinely broke down. Local leaders died or fled. Courts stopped functioning. With so many dead, property ownership became uncertain. Entire households disappeared, leaving valuables unclaimed. In the absence of legal authority, many took what they wanted simply because no one could stop them. The trust that held medieval society together between lords and peasants, employers and workers, neighbors and families, was severely weakened. Economic structures also changed dramatically. Before the plague, labor was abundant and workers had little bargaining power. After the plague, labor became scarce. Surviving workers realized their value had increased. They demanded higher wages and better conditions. They moved to places where they would be better paid. Lords and employers tried to prevent this shift by passing laws that fixed wages at pre-plague levels. However, these laws were largely unenforceable. No one could stop workers from leaving for better opportunities. This tension contributed to major uprisings in the decades that followed, including the Peasants' Revolt in England in 1381 and similar uprisings in France and elsewhere. The plague shattered the idea that society was stable and divinely ordered. Before the plague, people believed that social hierarchy reflected God's will. The church was seen as the bridge between humanity and salvation. The nobility were thought to be naturally born to rule. Peasants were expected to accept their place. But the plague revealed how fragile these structures were. Priests and nobles died just as easily as peasants. Authority could not protect itself. The idea that society was fixed and eternal began to weaken. That shift helped create the conditions for later cultural transformations, the Renaissance, the Reformation, and eventually the roots of modern thought. But during the plague years themselves, what people experienced was not renewal. It was fear, grief, anger, and the terrifying realization that civilization could collapse. The violence against Jews, the persecution of the vulnerable, and the moral breakdown in some places show how quickly fear can turn into cruelty. These events remind us of something uncomfortable. Human beings are capable of compassion but also of violence, especially when they feel powerless. We do not examine this history to condemn the people of the past. We cannot know how we might behave under similar pressures. Instead, we remember these events to recognize how fragile our moral and social structures are, and how easily fear can destroy them. Civilization depends on shared trust and shared responsibility. When those bonds break, the consequences can be devastating. What follows next is not a broad overview, but a closer look into one community, one moment. To understand the emotional reality of the plague, we turn from statistics to lived experience, from abstraction to the personal. We will follow the final ordinary day of a single village and then see what happened when the plague arrived. In that story, the scale of history becomes human. Prepare yourself. The next chapter is difficult but necessary. Part 6. The Last Day of a Village, Waram Percy. Let us imagine a village in the English Midlands in the spring of 1349. We will call it Waram Percy, a real medieval village later abandoned and uncovered by archaeologists. On March 23rd of that year, life in Warham moved as it had for centuries. 60 families lived here, about 300 people altogether. Their homes lined a single dirt road with a stone church standing above them all, as the only building meant to last longer than the lives of those who entered it. The people of Wareham were connected in every direction. Children grew up together, families intermarried, and the fields outside the village were worked in long strips shared among households, ensuring that no one had only good or only poor land. Beyond the fields lay common pastures for sheep and cattle, and farther still the woodlands, where the village gathered firewood and hunted small game. On that March morning, nothing seemed unusual. Thomas the smith rose early, as he always did. His strong hands and steady work were essential to everyone, for without him, no plow could be repaired, no horse shod. His wife Agnes tended the hearth and cared for their 3 surviving children. They had known loss like most families of the time. 2 children had died in infancy, but grief had long since become a quiet companion in village life. Across the road the carpenter began his day, and down by the stream, Margaret the widow, old by the standards of her time, collected water, surviving through the charity of neighbors who understood that someday they too would grow old and need the kindness of others. The rhythm of the day unfolded as always. Men prepared the fields for spring planting. Children completed chores and played running games afterward. And the church bell called the devout to morning mass. The talk among workers at midday mentioned plague only briefly. The sickness had devastated London, they had heard, but Wareham was far removed from the crowded towns where such things thrived. They believed they were protected by distance, or perhaps by God. But the next day, a traveling peddler arrived, carrying goods in his pack and news in his voice. He had come from the county town where the plague had appeared. He stayed one night at the alehouse, unaware that rats had hidden in his belongings. The rats carried fleas, and the fleas carried the disease. In the dark warmth of the thatched roof, they spread quickly, far faster than fear or rumor. Within days, the alehouse keeper fell ill. At first it seemed like fever from the cold spring air, but when the painful swellings appeared in his groin, the village priest recognized the signs. He had heard travelers speak of the Black Death. He knew what it meant, though he could do nothing to stop it. By the time the villagers tried to isolate the alehouse, the fleas had already spread to other houses, hidden in clothing, beds, and the straw floors, where people walked barefoot each night. The illness moved with terrible speed. A few days later, Thomas the smith sickened. Agnes tended to him as best she could, though she knew what the outcome likely was. When he died, she and their children washed and wrapped his body before Father Edmund buried him hurriedly, for there were too many dead and more dying each day. Soon the priest himself fell ill. Before he died, he asked the steward to hear his confession. With Father Edmund gone, the village not only mourned a familiar face, they lost their spiritual guide, their voice of comfort, their connection to God. The village became quiet. Doors that had always stood open were now barred. Families stayed inside their homes, but the plague did not respect walls. It spread through touch, through breath, through the unseen movement of fleas. By mid-April, dozens were dead. The fields lay untouched. The spring planting did not happen. The very foundation of village life, its food supply, was collapsing. When the plague finally loosened its grip, nearly a third of Wareham was gone. Those who survived emerged to a world that no longer resembled the one they had known. Many houses stood empty. The families who had lived in them had disappeared. Some survivors, especially the young, abandoned the village entirely. With so many dead across England, laborers were suddenly valuable, and wages rose. People who had once been tied to land and lured now saw the possibility of a different life somewhere else. Wareham limped on for several generations, but it never recovered its former strength. Eventually, in the 15th century, the village was deserted altogether. The houses sank into the earth, the fields returned to grass, and the church, though roofless now, still stands. Archaeologists would later uncover pottery, tools, hearths, and animal bones, small traces of lives once lived with routine and hope. Thomas, Agnes, Widow Margaret, Father Edmund. Most of their names were not recorded in written history. They were ordinary people, unremarkable in their own time, and yet their story is the story of thousands of villages across Europe. To understand their lives is to see the Black Death not as a statistic, but as a lived catastrophe, one that reshaped families, communities, and the future of society itself. Part 7. Society Collapses. The End of Feudalism. The cultural encounter between the Igbo society and the incoming colonial forces in Things Fall Apart unfolds gradually, but its effects are deep and lasting. Before the arrival of Europeans, the Igbo world was organized with its own belief systems, leadership structures, and communal traditions. The society valued strength, honor, fertility, kinship, and the rhythm of agricultural seasons. Personal identity was closely linked to the clan, titles, and ancestral heritage. Life followed a balance: respect for the gods, reverence for elders, and accountability to the earth. The community had its own systems of justice, religion, medicine, conflict resolution, and education through oral tradition. Nothing in their world was random or without meaning. However, this cultural structure faced profound change once the missionaries and colonial administrators arrived. At first, the contact between the two cultures appeared mild, almost quiet. The foreigners approached the Igbo people through religion, particularly Christianity. Missionaries began preaching about one God, heaven, salvation, and the rejection of traditional gods as false or evil. The message seemed harmless to many at first, just another belief system among others. But behind the calm voice of religion was a more transformative force, a new worldview that challenged and undermined the foundations of Igbo identity. The early converts were those who felt marginal in the society. People like Nwoye, who struggled to accept some harsh customs, such as the killing of Ikemefuna and the abandonment of twins in the forest, found emotional refuge in Christianity. The Christian message spoke of forgiveness, compassion, and equality before God. This promise offered relief to individuals who felt neglected or constrained within traditional norms. The church thus became a shelter for the powerless and those at the margins, outcasts, men without titles, women who faced social restrictions, and youths uncertain about their identity. As the church grew, tensions slowly emerged. The new faith was not simply a spiritual choice. It created a division within families and the community. When individuals like Nwoye abandoned ancestral worship, it was not perceived as a personal decision, but as a betrayal of the entire clan. The Igbo worldview was communal, not individualistic. To reject the gods was to reject one's ancestors, history, and identity. This fractured the shared values that held the community together. The cultural encounter became emotional, personal, and deeply painful. The conflict intensified when the missionaries challenged the authority of the traditional priests and elders. Sacred objects, ancestral shrines, and rituals were labeled as primitive or sinful. The church taught that salvation was only possible through the Christian God, and that the traditional gods were powerless. In time, this ideological shift weakened the spiritual power that had held the clan together for generations. The authority of elders and priests declined, not through force at first, but through belief. Once the religious foundation began to crumble, political transformation followed quickly. Colonial administrators arrived and established a new legal system. They set up courts, introduced foreign laws, and appointed warrant chiefs, sometimes choosing men who had no traditional legitimacy. The colonial government claimed that it was bringing order and civilization, but in reality, it dismantled the existing structures of authority and social harmony. The traditional system, which had relied on consensus and consultation among elders, was replaced with a hierarchy controlled by the colonizers. This imposition of foreign power also reshaped economics. Trade patterns changed, and Western goods entered local markets. Money replaced traditional exchange systems, and Christian-run schools became centers of influence. Learning the English language became associated with progress and power. Those who attended mission schools gained access to jobs and new social positions, while those who remained in the traditional system faced marginalization. Over time, power began shifting from warriors and elders to educated converts who could communicate with colonial officials. The society's value system was being rearranged. Amid this upheaval, Okonkwo stands as a figure caught between two worlds. He represents the old order, built on strength, masculine pride, and unwavering loyalty to tradition. His return from exile is marked by the realization that the clan he once knew is changing rapidly. The sense of unity that once defined the community is slipping away. Where there had been shared identity, now there are fractured loyalties. His attempts to rally resistance come too late, and his final act reveals the tragic collapse of not only his personal world, but the moral and cultural fabric of his community. The cultural encounter is not simply a matter of two societies meeting. It is a collision that changes the identity of individuals and the fate of a community. The transformation is painful, slow, and internal as much as external. The new culture does not replace the old in a sudden sweep. Instead, it erodes it gradually from within. Belief systems, family bonds, and generational continuity are tested and strained. The younger generation begins to see the world differently from the elders, and this generational divide becomes one of the most powerful forces driving the transformation. At the heart of this encounter is a deeper question. How does a society maintain its cultural identity in the face of external power? The Igbo people are not portrayed as passive victims. They are shown wrestling with the meaning of change. Some seek adaptation, others resistance, and still others escape into acceptance of a new identity. Achebe reveals that cultural encounter is not a story of simple defeat or domination. It is a complex negotiation where both loss and transformation unfold side by side. In the end, the cultural transformation depicted in the story was not forced only through violence, although violence was certainly part of it. The real transformation began in the mind. The colonizers did not destroy the society by swords alone. They introduced a story, a belief, a new logic that gradually reshaped how people saw themselves and the universe. Once the meanings of life, death, purpose, morality, and identity began to shift, the cultural foundation weakened. The community did not fall because it was physically overpowered. It fell because the shared understanding of life that once held people together was fractured. This encounter reflects a larger truth about history. Cultures can be transformed not only through conquest, but through narrative, education, and the redefinition of values. In Achebe's work, the transformation of the Igbo world is a reminder that identity is not only inherited, but constantly shaped through interaction with others. The story demonstrates how cultural contact can enrich, challenge, or destabilize a society, depending on how it is negotiated. The result in this case was not cultural extinction, but profound transformation that redefined the meaning of community, power, belief, and identity for generations to come. Part 8. The Aftermath. The cultural encounter between the Igbo society and the incoming colonial forces in Things Fall Apart unfolds gradually, but its effects are deep and lasting. Before the arrival of Europeans, the Igbo world was organized with its own belief systems, leadership structures, and communal traditions. The society valued strength, honor, fertility, kinship, and the rhythm of agricultural seasons. Personal identity was closely linked to the clan, titles, and ancestral heritage. Life followed a balance: respect for the gods, reverence for elders, and accountability to the earth. The community had its own systems of justice, religion, medicine, conflict resolution, and education through oral tradition. Nothing in their world was random or without meaning. However, this cultural structure faced profound change once the missionaries and colonial administrators arrived. At first, the contact between the two cultures appeared mild, almost quiet. The foreigners approached the Igbo people through religion, particularly Christianity. Missionaries began preaching about one God, heaven, salvation, and the rejection of traditional gods as false or evil. The message seemed harmless to many at first, just another belief system among others. But behind the calm voice of religion was a more transformative force, a new worldview that challenged and undermined the foundations of Igbo identity. The early converts were those who felt marginal in the society. People like Nwoye, who struggled to accept some harsh customs, such as the killing of Ikemefuna and the abandonment of twins in the forest, found emotional refuge in Christianity. The Christian message spoke of forgiveness, compassion, and equality before God. This promise offered relief to individuals who felt neglected or constrained within traditional norms. The church thus became a shelter for the powerless and those at the margins, outcasts, men without titles, women who face social restrictions, and youths uncertain about their identity. As the church grew, tensions slowly emerged. The new faith was not simply a spiritual choice. It created a division within families and the community. When individuals like Nwoye abandoned ancestral worship, it was not perceived as a personal decision, but as a betrayal of the entire clan. The Igbo worldview was communal, not individualistic. To reject the gods was to reject one's ancestors, history, and identity. This fractured the shared values that held the community together. The cultural encounter became emotional, personal, and deeply painful. The conflict intensified when the missionaries challenged the authority of the traditional priests and elders. Sacred objects, ancestral shrines, and rituals were labeled as primitive or sinful. The church taught that salvation was only possible through the Christian God, and that the traditional gods were powerless. In time, this ideological shift weakened the spiritual power that had held the clan together for generations. The authority of elders and priests declined, not through force at first, but through belief. Once the religious foundation began to crumble, political transformation followed quickly. Colonial administrators arrived and established a new legal system. They set up courts, introduced foreign laws, and appointed warrant chiefs, sometimes choosing men who had no traditional legitimacy. The colonial government claimed that it was bringing order and civilization, but in reality, it dismantled the existing structures of authority and social harmony. The traditional system, which had relied on consensus and consultation among elders, was replaced with a hierarchy controlled by the colonizers. This imposition of foreign power also reshaped economics. Trade patterns changed, and Western goods entered local markets. Money replaced traditional exchange systems, and Christian-run schools became centers of influence. Learning the English language became associated with progress and power. Those who attended mission schools gained access to jobs and new social positions, while those who remained in the traditional system faced marginalization. Over time, power began shifting from warriors and elders to educated converts who could communicate with colonial officials. The society's value system was being rearranged. Amid this upheaval, Okonkwo stands as a figure caught between two worlds. He represents the old order, built on strength, masculine pride, and unwavering loyalty to tradition. His return from exile is marked by the realization that the clan he once knew is changing rapidly. The sense of unity that once defined the community is slipping away. Where there had been shared identity, now there are fractured loyalties. His attempts to rally resistance come too late, and his final act reveals the tragic collapse of not only his personal world, but the moral and cultural fabric of his community. The cultural encounter is not simply a matter of two societies meeting. It is a collision that changes the identity of individuals and the fate of a community. The transformation is painful, slow, and internal as much as external. The new culture does not replace the old in a sudden sweep. Instead, it erodes it gradually from within. Belief systems, family bonds, and generational continuity are tested and strained. The younger generation begins to see the world differently from the elders, and this generational divide becomes one of the most powerful forces driving the transformation. At the heart of this encounter is a deeper question. How does a society maintain its cultural identity in the face of external power? The Igbo people are not portrayed as passive victims. They are shown wrestling with the meaning of change. Some seek adaptation, others resistance, and still others escape into acceptance of a new identity. Achebe reveals that cultural encounter is not a story of simple defeat or domination. It is a complex negotiation where both loss and transformation unfold side by side. In the end, the cultural transformation depicted in the story was not forced only through violence, although violence was certainly part of it. The real transformation began in the mind. The colonizers did not destroy the society by swords alone. They introduced a story, a belief, a new logic that gradually reshaped how people saw themselves and the universe. Once the meanings of life, death, purpose, morality, and identity began to shift, the cultural foundation weakened. The community did not fall because it was physically overpowered. It fell because the shared understanding of life that once held people together was fractured. This encounter reflects a larger truth about history. Cultures can be transformed not only through conquest, but through narrative, education, and the redefinition of values. In Achebe's work, the transformation of the Igbo world is a reminder that identity is not only inherited, but constantly shaped through interaction with others. The story demonstrates how cultural contact can enrich, challenge, or destabilize a society, depending on how it is negotiated. The result in this case was not cultural extinction, but profound transformation that redefined the meaning of community, power, belief, and identity for generations to come. Part 9. The Art of Death, Memento Mori and Dance Macabre. After the Black Death swept through Europe and took nearly half of the population, the presence of death became impossible to ignore. People had witnessed loss on a massive scale. Families, towns, and entire communities were devastated. In the face of such trauma, European culture needed to find ways to process grief, fear, and uncertainty. Art became one of the main ways people tried to understand what had happened to them and make sense of life in a world where death seemed to always be close. One of the most striking artistic developments after the plague was the Dance Macabre, also known as the Dance of Death. This theme began to appear throughout Europe in the late 14th and 15th centuries. It became a popular subject in paintings, murals, manuscripts, sculptures, plays, songs, and public performances. The idea was simple but powerful. Death was personified, usually as a skeleton or decaying corpse, leading people of every social status in a dance toward the grave. In these images, emperors, popes, kings, merchants, peasants, and even children were shown dancing with death. The message was direct and impossible to ignore. Death comes for everyone, no matter how powerful or wealthy they are. Once death arrives, all social divisions disappear. One of the most famous examples of this theme was the Dance Macabre mural in the Cemetery of the Holy Innocents in Paris, painted around 1424. This was the same cemetery that later led to the creation of the Paris catacombs because it became so overcrowded with bodies. The mural depicted death leading representatives of every class in society toward burial. Each figure had verses written beside them, reflecting on the inevitability of death. Although the original mural was destroyed in the 17th century, descriptions and copies survive, and similar artworks were created across Europe. These artworks appeared in churches, public squares, and private books. They served as visual reminders that mortality is inevitable, and everyone shares the same fate. This artistic and cultural message had a psychological purpose. People needed to cope with the overwhelming trauma of losing so many loved ones. The dance macabre helped people understand that their grief was part of a universal human experience, not a personal injustice. If even the most important and powerful people in society died, then the suffering of ordinary people was not meaningless or unfair. It was part of the shared reality of human life. The idea of memento mori, meaning remember that you must die, also became widespread during this period. Although the phrase already existed before the plague, the experience of widespread death made it urgent and meaningful. Skulls became common symbols, appearing in jewelry, carvings, religious art, and even everyday objects. These images were not meant to frighten people, but to remind them that life was temporary and that spiritual preparation was essential. Wealthy people began commissioning transy tombs, also called double-decker tombs. These tombs showed the deceased person twice. On the top level, they were shown as they appeared in life, dressed elegantly and with authority. On the lower level, their body was shown as a corpse, decaying and eaten by worms. The contrast was meant to be shocking. It reminded viewers that power and beauty in life are temporary, but death is certain for everyone. One of the most well-known examples is the tomb of Cardinal Jean de Lagrange, created in the 1390s, which displays this dramatic contrast clearly. The message was unmistakable. No matter how important a person was, they would eventually decay, just like everyone else. Religious art also changed in response to the plague. The suffering of Christ and the grief of Mary were portrayed with new emotional intensity. Artists showed the crucifixion with raw detail, emphasizing pain and sorrow. Images of saints being tortured or martyred became more graphic. The Pietà, which depicts Mary holding the dead body of Jesus, became especially popular because it emphasized human grief, something plague survivors deeply understood. People had experienced so much pain and loss that they were drawn to images that reflected their emotional reality. One of the clearest artistic representations of plague trauma is the Triumph of Death fresco in Pisa, created around 1350. In this painting, death is shown as a winged skeleton attacking a group of wealthy young nobles who believed they were safe and protected. The landscape is filled with corpses, suffering, and battles for souls. The fresco captures the fear and chaos of the time, and its intensity reflects a world that felt close to the end. Later artists, such as Hieronymus Bosch, continued exploring themes related to judgment, sin, and death. Although Bosch worked more than a century after the first plague outbreak, the emotional and cultural shock of the Black Death remained strong. Literature also reflected the world created by the plague. Giovanni Boccaccio's Decameron, written right after the plague's first wave in Italy, begins with a dark description of death and social breakdown. But inside the frame story are humorous and lighthearted tales, showing that joy and storytelling were ways of coping with tragedy. Similarly, Geoffrey Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, written later in England, depicts a society trying to rebuild. The pilgrims in the story come from different social classes, reflecting the increased social mixing that occurred after the plague altered the structure of society. Characters such as the wife of Bath show how new roles and freedoms emerged, particularly for women who inherited wealth after male family members died. Writers such as Petrarch, who lost his beloved Laura to the plague, wrote poetry that focused on personal grief and memory. The emphasis on individual emotion helped shape the development of Renaissance humanism. Books known as Ars Moriendi, The Art of Dying, appeared in the 15th century. These books taught people how to prepare spiritually for death, which could come at any moment. They described the emotional struggles of the dying and guided readers toward peaceful acceptance and salvation. They were extremely popular because death remained a constant presence. Music changed too. Requiem masses and funeral music became more prominent. Composers created emotional settings of hymns about death and sorrow. Music gave people a way to mourn collectively, to grieve together rather than suffer alone. Even children's culture may have absorbed plague themes. The nursery rhyme, "Ring Around the Rosie," is often linked to plague, although scholars continue to debate the accuracy of the connection. Whether or not the rhyme truly references plague symptoms, there is no doubt that plague entered popular memory and folklore across Europe. The image of the plague doctor with the long beaked mask became a cultural symbol of both fear and fascination. These figures appeared in art and theater as representations of death itself. Meanwhile, architecture shifted from grand Gothic heights to more restrained forms, possibly reflecting a turn away from idealism and toward practical reality. Tombs became more elaborate as people tried to preserve memory and identity. The cult of saints, especially Saint Sebastian and Saint Roch, grew stronger as people turned to them for spiritual protection. Manuscripts included images of skulls, bones, and other reminders of mortality, even in scenes of beauty, symbolizing the constant presence of death. The printing press, invented around 1450, helped spread these ideas widely. Treatises on plague, religious texts about death, and artistic works circulated across Europe, making cultural responses more uniform. Scientific illustration also improved as medical scholars tried to study disease more closely. People wanted to make sense of what had once seemed impossible to understand. Gardens and landscapes began to reflect a desire for control and order after experiencing chaos. Fashion changed too. Some people tried to enforce strict social rules, while others embraced luxury and enjoyment because life felt uncertain. Festivals such as Carnival grew more intense, giving people a temporary space to release grief through celebration. Religious plays reenacted themes of judgment, salvation, and death, helping entire communities confront trauma together. Across every form of culture, the same emotional truth appeared. Art helped people survive. It did not erase suffering, but it gave shape to it. The dance macabre showed that death unites everyone. The memento mori reminded people that life is fragile. Religious and artistic expressions of grief allowed people to keep living, even while carrying the memory of tragedy. The cultural legacy of the Black Death lasted long after the plague itself faded. The awareness of mortality, the emphasis on personal experience, and the need to find meaning in suffering all influenced European culture for centuries. Even today, the memento mori tradition remains visible in art, literature, philosophy, and religious practices. Now, as we move forward to the final section, we ask ourselves, what can we learn from this history? What does the Black Death reveal about human resilience, about the fragility of civilization, and about how societies confront catastrophe? With these questions in mind, we turn to Part 10, Lessons from the Abyss. Part 10, Lessons from the Abyss, What the Black Death Teaches. We have walked through one of the darkest chapters in human history. We have seen a world collapse under the weight of a disease that arrived without warning and reshaped everything it touched. Now, as we return to our own time, we must consider what this catastrophe teaches us. The Black Death does not simply belong to the past. It continues to speak to us, offering lessons about who we are, how we live, how societies stand, and how they fall. These lessons are not comforting. They are difficult, essential truths drawn from immense suffering and survival. The first lesson is that civilization is fragile. In medieval Europe, life felt established and permanent. The church guided belief, kings governed kingdoms, and communities assumed their world was ordained and unchanging. Yet, within a few short years, half the population was gone. Entire villages vanished. Institutions that seemed eternal cracked under the pressure. The Black Death revealed how quickly everything familiar can disappear. Governments, economies, social order, and systems of knowledge can collapse when stress exceeds their limits. This teaches us that we must not mistake stability for permanence. Preparedness and flexibility are far more important than simply feeling secure. Yet the second lesson balances the first. Humans are resilient. Despite unimaginable loss, Europeans did not fade away. They adapted, they grieved, rebuilt, and found ways to continue living in changed worlds. Within generations, societies reshaped themselves. Life did not return to how it had been, but it continued. Human beings possess extraordinary strength in the face of disaster, even when their circumstances seem unendurable. Survival is not effortless, but it is possible. The continuation of life after catastrophe is one of humanity's oldest and most powerful stories. The third lesson is that crisis reveals human nature. During the Black Death, there were individuals who showed immense courage. Doctors stayed with the dying. Priests performed last rites, knowing each blessing could be their final act. Neighbors cared for one another, even when fear told them to stay away. But there were also those who fled, who hoarded resources, who turned against others out of terror. Some communities came together, while others fractured. Catastrophe does not create character, it exposes it. When normal life falls away, what remains are the values individuals have cultivated within themselves. The fourth lesson is the danger of scapegoating. Fear seeks someone to blame. During the plague, many turned their anger toward minorities, especially Jewish communities. They were accused of poisoning wells and conspiring to spread disease. These accusations were false, but they led to violence, exile, and massacre. When societies are frightened, the most vulnerable are at risk. Crisis can twist fear into cruelty. This reminds us that moral responsibility does not disappear during disaster, it becomes more urgent. Protecting the vulnerable is not only compassion, it is protection of our shared humanity. Another lesson concerns inequality. The plague killed rich and poor alike, but circumstances shaped survival. Wealthier families had space, mobility, cleaner environments, and access to better food. Poorer communities, crowded into cities or bound to labor, faced greater danger. Catastrophe highlights the gaps that already exist and magnifies them. If a society allows deep inequality during peaceful times, it ensures greater suffering when crisis arrives. Preparing for the future requires addressing these inequalities now, not later. The sixth lesson is about knowledge and humility. Medieval doctors were highly trained and deeply confident in their understanding of disease, but their theories were wrong. Their treatments often caused harm. Their certainty prevented them from adapting, as evidence contradicted their beliefs. Knowledge is essential, but certainty can be dangerous. The ability to question assumptions is as important as the ability to learn. Science advances through humility and the willingness to revise beliefs when confronted with new reality. The seventh lesson is that strong institutions must be adaptable. Many medieval institutions collapsed because they could not change. Those that survived were the ones flexible enough to adjust to new conditions. Systems that rigidly protect tradition without room for adaptation are vulnerable during crisis. Modern societies must build institutions capable of evolving when the world changes suddenly. Strength comes not from being immovable, but from being able to bend without breaking. The eighth lesson is that trauma lasts beyond the event. The Black Death left psychological scars that shaped culture art, religion, and philosophy for generations. Europeans developed a deep awareness of death's closeness. Paintings, music, and writing reflected grief and the fragile nature of life. Trauma does not disappear when the crisis ends. If ignored, it can shape societies in harmful ways. Healing requires acknowledgement, reflection, and understanding, not repression. The ninth lesson is that catastrophe accelerates change already underway. The Black Death did not create new movements from nothing. It pushed existing trends forward. Social mobility increased. Economic power shifted from landowners to workers. Local languages gained prominence in literature. Governments grew more centralized. Catastrophe does not invent new destinies. It speeds the ones already forming. Those who recognize underlying shifts can shape the future instead of being overwhelmed by it. The final lesson is that meaning-making is necessary for survival. Medieval survivors needed to understand why such suffering had occurred. Some saw the plague as a divine test. Others used it as a reason to reform society. Artists created symbols reminding people to value life while knowing it would end. These interpretations, whether religious, social, or philosophical, gave people a way to move forward. Humans cannot endure hardship without finding meaning in it. We must make sense of suffering in order to heal and continue. These lessons are not locked in the past. They apply to pandemics, wars, climate challenges, economic collapses, and personal tragedies. The Black Death shows us both our vulnerability and our resilience. It humbles us and encourages us. It reminds us that while civilizations can break, they can also rebuild. Humans have endured catastrophe before, and we can endure again. The medieval world was forever changed by plague, but it did not vanish. New societies emerged. New ideas flourished. Life continued because people chose to continue, and this is the deepest lesson of all. In every age, in every crisis, humanity's greatest strength is the decision to go on, to care for one another, to rebuild, to create meaning, to live fully while life lasts. Remember that life is finite, but also remember that while you live, you can create meaning, connection, and change. The story of humanity is not the story of disaster. It is the story of survival.